today we're going to talk about a couple of things. First, we're going to talk just a little bit about slavery itself, which is a bit difficult to do because, this is such an experience that would have differed from person to person. So just keep in mind that we're very much generalizing here, talking about some of the things that we can sort of assume were probably true of a lot of people. But we certainly don't want to forget that there are just millions of voices here that we're not able to really look at every single one, and so many of which, we don't have any kind of record or written account or those sorts of things. That some of that is actually a bit scarce, but we can get a very good picture of what slavery was like for the people that endured it from some of those things, those sources that we do have, some of those which you've read over in the past couple of days. And then we're also going to look back at, we talked about abolition last week, we're going to look at the responses to that and how both Northerners, people in free states, did not practice slavery, and of course Southerners that did practice slavery, or at least from slave-holding states, reacted to abolition and how they fought back against it, because obviously they were not very accepting of abolition at all, and so they found ways to either try to silence abolitionists or counter-argue the things that they were saying, and so forth. Now, of course, slavery, like I was just mentioning, it's hard to really, we need to really avoid saying that this was like this for all slaves and this was like this for all slaves, because again, it was different for different people. But it is definitely a story of people surviving terrible injustice and terrible cruelty, a system of abuse. It is about resilience. It is about endurance, and we know that this was not a happy existence for hardly anyone. So a couple of things that we can use to sort of help us understand what life might have been like for people enslaved. And again, a lot of this is going to depend on, as you saw with some of the documents you looked at, some of this is going to depend on the person's age, it's going to depend on their gender, it is going to depend on the kind of plantation or the kind of property in which they worked, it's going to depend on the location of that. All of that would cause variance in these sort of things. But some realities that we know were consistent for slaves no matter where they were was the way that slave codes limited their rights, or took away any kind of rights, really, not just limited them. But how slave codes, which we talked about before, if you recall, slave codes were the laws that governed slavery. They were the laws that set up slavery, that defined what slavery was, that protected it legally, and that prohibited slaves from, essentially doing anything that they chose to do, that they wanted to do. Slave codes, as we talked about before, would have restricted, certainly taken away any sort of legal rights from slaves, certainly not allowing them to hold property or to, even serve on a jury or even give testimony in court, basic legal things like that. But really stripping them of any sort of humanity at all. Not allowing slaves to know how to read or write, restricting their movement, not being able to be in a certain place without, written permission, that sort of thing. Slave marriages were not considered legal according to slave codes. So these were things that, stripped people of any kind of rights, any kind of humanity, and defined them as property, defining them as someone else's property to which they could do with as they pleased. As far as life for slaves on a daily basis, again, that's going to depend on the kind of place where they are working. If it's a large cotton plantation versus if they're more in the upper South, there is a small, much smaller aspect of slavery, but that was in more urban areas. But of course, we know that most slaves worked on larger plantations, that most of them worked on large farms, where they were organized into gang labor, basically, where an overseer, they were told them, gave them tasks to do, monitored their tasks. And it was pretty much a sun up to sundown day of hard manual labor in the fields, whether they were cotton fields or tobacco fields, sugar plantations, or what have you. So probably a vast majority of them were field workers on larger plantations or larger farms or larger properties. A smaller percentage of them may have been domestic workers working in the home, either as cooks or other sorts of personal servants, maids and so forth to the slaver's family, butlers, things like that. Some slaves, though, did have specific skills. There were some that had more skilled labor that might have had more specific jobs, like as a blacksmith or a carpenter. There were some that had more specified skills, and those may have even been able to be hired out sometimes by another plantation owner or something. They might have been able to make a little money, but probably not. If they did, that money probably went to their owner. But there were some that had some more specific skills, particularly in more urban areas and on some larger plantations. You might have found that as well, where the plantation was so large they had, like an actual blacksmith shop or something on the plantation. You could have seen that. Again, they were organized either into like a task system where they had like specific jobs they had to do throughout the day. And once they finished those jobs, they were done for the day. Or a lot of the time, particularly on those larger cotton plantations and big tobacco plantations, it was gang labor, sometimes even chained together, being supervised by an overseer, which was oftentimes it's usually something that a more poor white farmer would do. That was not usually something the plantation owner was doing, or a slave driver that was, making sure they were doing the work and all of that, sun up to sundown. Very grueling, backbreaking work from the time children are young until they were essentially too old to physically do the kind of work. They would live in slave quarters, which were just basically 1 to 2 room shacks. You may have multiple families living in those slave quarters. So this was a grueling experience. It was not the way that Southerners will try to portray it as, no, these people are just our servants and they like it and we're all happy. This was quite a system that was enforced and validated violence and abuse and was not pleasant for anyone. Now, as far as this, I guess, is a little slightly off topic because we're talking about free African Americans, which would not, of course, be slaves. But we do want to mention what life would have been like for free African Americans, for people that may have been born free, but oftentimes you're talking about people that have become free at some point in their life, either by running away or by being freed by an owner or something like that. But one thing, the thing to point out there is that, first of all, the more in the deep South, like this area, you're not going to see too many free African Americans. That would be a very, very, very small number. You're going to have more free African Americans the more north you go, particularly when you get into those upper South states, Virginia, Maryland. That's where you're going to see much higher concentrations of free African Americans. But they'd always be a minority. So it's more likely to be in those more urban areas of the South, in which we know there weren't that many of, but that's where you'll see more of that. But another thing to point out about free African Americans is that freedom did not necessarily mean equality. Okay, freedom did not mean equality. Just because people were free today. We'll talk about tomorrow. Thank you. This didn't mean that people had the same rights as a white person. In most states, free African Americans, a lot of them still could not own property. Most of them still could not vote. And there was also, just aside from just the legal barriers and not having the same legal rights, just the basic discrimination, just being treated differently, not being allowed to go certain places, to do certain things, to hold certain jobs, being paid less for those jobs, and just not receiving the same amount of dignity and respect as anybody else. So even being a free person didn't necessarily mean that life was great, and life was, although it was probably much better. I'm not pull on each of these things a little bit one at a time. Life was probably a little bit better and a little bit different. They were certainly free and in control of their own destiny to an extent, but it certainly did not mean that things were great. We're going to talk a little bit about slave culture, some of which you have read a little bit about. I'm going to talk about each of these individual things separately here in just a second. The interesting thing about slave culture, really African American culture, we just did this. You did last week, and we'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow, just to make sure we got all the things we need to get from it. You did some work last week looking at American writers and American literature and American artwork, and one of the things you should have gained from that is that in this so-called American Renaissance, you had this for the first time, an American culture that was really defined as something that was unique to America and something that was respected in the world and something that was, seen as just as good or better than European culture, whether it was writing or whether it was painting and things like that, whatever it was. But really and truly, the first real American culture is not that. It is African American culture. The first culture outside of Native American culture that was unique to America, that was something that was not exactly European, that was not exactly American, that was not exactly African, that was not exactly anything, that was a totally new type of culture, whether it's religion, whether it's music, whether it's stories, was African American culture, that they were contributing, that slaves were contributing and creating something unique to America centuries before any of that stuff. Of course, it wasn't noticed, it wasn't valued, but they were making far greater contributions to American culture centuries before any of those published writers like, Henry David Thoreau and all of those were. And slave culture was very much a blend. It was a blend of African traditions, of various tribes, of various religions, blending that with European/American traditions and creating something that, again, was different and unique and something that provided, a source of comfort, that provided a source of resistance, that provided a sense of community, something that, it's hard to sometimes explain how so many people could have endured something so horrible for so long. So it truly is a story of strong resistance, and not just like outright fighting, but some of that is finding comfort and finding solace and finding a sense of community and finding a sense of hope in some of these things that they were creating culturally. So it not only, is entertaining for purposes of we're going to sing songs and write stories to entertain ourselves, but this was very much it's a coping mechanism as well, and something in which, helps people to persevere and have an identity in a system that tries to strip people of identity. So it's a really amazing act of defiance, to say we're going to create, even if it's unintentional, we create something that helps us define ourselves as something different and something special and something important, even though we're in a situation where we're being told we're not special and we're not important and we're just a commodity. A real tribute to that resistance. For families, for slave families, the reality was, as you read from some of your readings, what most often would happen to a lot of slave families. They'd be split up. Yeah, it was not very common for someone to stay with their immediate blood-related family their whole life. That it was not uncommon for people to be sold away from their parents, from their children, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, that they were, in constant fear of that. And you read some of the accounts, you read people being sold multiple times in their life. And so family became more of an extended thing. People considered their family not just to be blood relationships, but to be just those around them. And they extended those familial relationships, taking care of each other, sort of almost like semi-adopting each other as extended family, because those bonds of blood, weren't going to be respected. And so they relied on each other for that. They relied on that extended family, that extended kinship network, and that strong sense of community and family not being necessarily defined by blood in order to endure and in order to lean on each other and take care of each other. Religion was a very important part of the lives of a lot of slaves, and something that was very important to their daily life and something that they find very encouraging and inspiring. Now, in these days, slaves were not allowed to have their own churches. They worshipped with their owners. But they did practice, particularly in some more rural plantations and rural areas where they may not have actually been going to churches, might have just been having worship services there amongst themselves. There they very much did blend Christianity with some African cultures, with more lively kind of religious ceremonies, more charismatic kind of ceremonies with dance and with shouting and with chanting. Those were kind of things that were sort of part of a lot of African traditions of tribal chants and, like I said, dancing and that sort of thing. And so they incorporated a lot of that stuff and blended it with very European/American Christianity. But there was a lot about Christianity that slaves found and tended to focus on, stories of redemption. There's so many themes of hope, so many things and things in the Bible that slaves probably found very encouraging. There are so many stories, so many parts of the Bible that tend to be tributes of people who are oppressed, people that are enslaved even. Think of, Genesis and the Hebrews and those kind of things, and that a promise for deliverance, a promise of salvation, a promise of freedom in some way. The Bible's full of those kinds of stories. And so that provided that hope oftentimes. There are great themes of hope for the oppressed and deliverance, and that one day things will be better even if it's not in that particular lifetime. So they probably found those very uplifting as well. Those religious themes, as well as other things, work their way into music, into stories, into dance, other kinds of things that slaves may have used, partially as entertainment. Some of this was, at the end of the day, and we're going to do something to enjoy, to entertain, but it is also about teaching, and it's also about giving people hope and finding that resilience. So music, spirituals, of course. Spirituals are, songs that slaves would sing to not just pass the time. Some of them are like work songs that they might sing while they were in the field. Some of them were songs they might sing in their Sunday services. Some are just songs they might sing just to enjoy themselves. But if you know these spirituals or look some up, those are the common themes in them. It's a common theme of oppression and a promise of deliverance and a promise of a better future and, giving people that kind of hope. Telling all kinds of stories and folk tales. For example, the Brer Rabbit story. Y'all read one of those last week. And those eventually got adopted by Disney, and they got turned into cartoons. You've been to Disney World, ridden Splash Mountain ride? Yeah, that's the whole Brer Rabbit thing, which they're now going to change because of the Song of the South thing. They're going to retool it to make it less controversial and insensitive to some of those things. But those were slave folk tales that were told by slaves on, an oral tradition that was passed down here and there. And those kinds of stories, these sort of trickster tales, these little folk tales, which the Brer Rabbit stories are little trickster tales, those were really common among slaves. Because in that story, and that's the same thing goes through all Brer Rabbit stories. Who's kind of, how does Brer Rabbit get out of trouble in that story? He tricks the bear into, in that case, what did he trick him into doing? To give himself up, even though Brer Rabbit was the one that was doing the thing. He was the one killing the pigs or something. But he tricks the bear into making him say that he did it. And that's the common thing in all of Brer Rabbit stories. Again, going back to the Splash Mountain ride, if you've ever read it, and this is, again, a common thing in a lot of them, is he's always saying, whatever you do to me, just don't throw me in the briar patch. Just don't do that. And so in the end, what do they always do to him? They throw him in the briar patch. And what is the briar patch? Well, that's where he lives. That's his house. Yeah. So he's always tricking everybody into giving him what he wants. So those kind of stories of, the lesser creature, the one at the bottom of the food chain, the one that shouldn't be winning, somehow using trickery, using deceit, being clever, getting out of trouble and getting their way and getting the best of the bear or the fox or, the animal that should dominate over them was real common. That might have been something that was very hopeful to make people not only have a good laugh, but to kind of give people that hope that with being clever and being smarter, that maybe maybe they could improve their situation. Now, another way that slaves, of course, resist is not just by telling these stories and helping each other out, leaning on each other for family relationships. There are other ways that slaves, of course, resisted their enslavement. You read about some of those things as well. And interestingly, this is something that, for so long was taught so badly. The perception was in these days and for a long time after slavery ended that slaves didn't want to be free, that they were perfectly happy, that they had no interest in freedom. Yes. But of course, we now know that even though you may not have seen an outright slave rebellion happening every other day, which you didn't, that this was an institution that people were constantly resisting. They were always involved in an active state of resistance, even though that may not have meant that they were committing violent acts, even if that didn't mean they were trying to kill the slave owner and stuff like that, which that did happen sometimes too. A lot of times that resistance is real passive. A lot of the time that resistance is things like breaking tools, accidentally breaking the tools so they can't work that day, or even injuring the livestock, injuring the mule or whatever, so they couldn't work. Pretending they didn't know how to do something. You notice in one of the stories, that guy's name's not coming to me, not the young lady, but the man that was talking, the one that worked at a hotel for a while. Do you remember they called him the Don't Know Boy? Yes. Why did they call him the Don't Know Boy? Wouldn't tell anything. So they call him the Don't Know Boy, probably assuming that he's dumb. But really, what was it? He just wasn't going to tell him nothing so that he wouldn't be accused of anything. He couldn't be, it's all, if you don't say anything, then they don't have anything against you. And one of the questions I asked was, what kind of stereotype did that seem to lead to? Yeah, there becomes this stereotype that slaves were intellectually inferior, that they were not smart. Some of that was, a lot of it was, racism. A lot of it was an act. They would intentionally act like they didn't know how to do something, or they couldn't take directions and those kind of things. But it was a method of resistance. It was a way of slowing things down, of getting, using trickery, standing up to their owner, getting out of certain things, not doing certain things by not doing it well, not doing it right. But it does lead to these, stereotypes of slaves being unintelligent, lazy, slow. But a lot of that was simply a method of resistance that they were actively using probably each and every day. And there's no way to tell, how many people did that on a daily basis, how many people were doing that every single day, so forth and so on. Now, as far as outright rebellion, you don't see that too much, but it does happen. But most slave rebellions, outright insurrections, don't get off the ground. There's no telling, though, how many were thought about, how many were planned, and where they were found out before either somebody within their own community might tell on them because they didn't want to get in trouble, or some other people fell out, or they found out about it, or they chickened out of it, or well, that's a bad word to use, decided not to do it, or something like that. But there were a few attempts at slave rebellions. The most successful of which, we saw this one in the video the other day, was the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831. This was in Virginia. And Nat Turner was a slave in Virginia that believed, he saw this eclipse one day, and he believed that this eclipse was a sign from God telling him, anointing him, and commanding him to lead this slave rebellion. He's very, very religiously convicted and believes that he has like a vision almost, that he's on a divine mission, and convinced that God has chosen him to lead this slave revolt. So he gets several followers, and as you saw, talked about it in the video last week, they ran through the countryside of Virginia for several days, killing the slave, killing the white people, basically, a farmhouse after farmhouse. They killed more than 50 people before they were stopped. So this is one of the more successful, one of the more violent slave revolts in the United States, probably one of the biggest ones that ever got off the ground. But eventually, Nat Turner and his followers were captured. Took them days to find him, though. He was a wanted fugitive for several days, and he's eventually executed. But what do things like the Nat Turner Revolt kind of prove? something they didn't want to do. This was a situation they didn't want to be in. One of the things to talk about in a second is that Southerners and slave owners are constantly saying, this is no big thing, this is all fine, and nobody's unhappy with it. And it's only because abolitionists are stirring things up that anybody is, trying to resist this. But stuff like the Nat Turner Revolt demonstrated that clearly they did want freedom, and clearly they were trying to resist this. And there was something wrong here, which is something slave owners would not have liked everybody to know. So this kind of thing terrified Southerners, and it further agitates that slavery question when you see things like the Nat Turner Revolt happen. So again, this was few and far between. It didn't happen all that often. It's one of your more extreme versions of resistance, but that shouldn't be misunderstood that slaves didn't resist, because they did. And also they're running away. And sometimes the running away was not running away all the way to the Free State. Sometimes that might have been just running off to hide in the woods for a couple of days, just to kind of make people wonder where you were. You heard one of those accounts talked about the man when he was a young boy, going to hide under the floorboards for a little while, just to kind of get away. So sometimes it wasn't run away forever. It might have just been run away for a little bit. And that was going on constantly as well. Okay, so let's take a look at how both slave owners reacted and how non-slave owners even reacted to the abolition movement. So to the abolition movement, which we talked about how the Second Great Awakening kind of changes the conversation around abolition. You have more abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and others saying that slavery is morally wrong, that slavery is evil, that slavery has to be stopped. This is not just an economically backward system, but something that needs to be addressed immediately. Well, as we saw in that video, I think we have a misconception that everybody in the North or everybody in free states supported abolition and everybody in the South didn't, and it's certainly not that simple. We saw that in those northern cities, what kind of reaction was Garrison getting from a lot of people? Yeah, we saw Garrison being attacked by people those were people in the free states, those weren't slave owners. So the northern response, while some people are accepting it, of course they are, there are some that are changing their minds about it, but that's a very small number. On the whole, most northerners were not on board with abolition, and they were not supportive of abolition. Abolition will always be a minority movement. Even when the Civil War begins, it's going to be a minority movement. And it's going to gain followers, of course. It's going to get bigger, but it is never going to be something the majority of people supported. And we may wonder, well, why in the world would Northerners care? If they don't have slaves, if they not the ones that practice slavery, why would they care about it at all? And the reason for that is there's a few things. One, Northerners, they may not have practiced slavery, but they were somehow benefiting from it. What did the South produce a lot of? Cotton, and the North needed that. The North is industrialized, their textile mills, they needed Southern cotton. And so they didn't want a breakdown of the Southern economy if slavery were to be done away with. So there's a big economic argument, and that's probably one of the things that the South uses to its advantage most, is to say that if slavery goes and our economy collapses, that's the whole United States economy that's going to collapse. And it's those industrialists in the North that have those textile mills, they're going to be the ones suffering if the Southern cotton economy collapses. So there's that economic concern. And it also comes back to the point about just because people were free didn't mean they had full rights. And that was something that Northerners were worried about as well. They didn't want freed slaves moving up north. They didn't want freed slaves, which you're talking millions of people, they don't want them moving up north. They don't want them competing with them for jobs.
Teachers, at this time, any senior interested in talking with CVCC, please come to the media center. At this time, any senior interested in talking with CVCC, please come to the media center.
So they don't want that competition. They don't want. So there's a racism to it as well, because the question comes, okay, if you free slaves, then what? Do they have full rights? And most Northern people didn't want to do that, so they just would rather slavery stay where it was. And there's also just a great deal of indifference in the North. Indifference meaning they kind of don't have a strong opinion either way. Because for a lot of Northerners, they are rather ignorant to what slavery really is. They are ignorant to what it is really like because they don't see it and they don't experience it. It's not something that they are seeing on a daily basis, and all they really know of it for a lot of them is what slave owners are telling them, which is that everything's fine, that it's no big thing. And so some of them don't have too much of a response either way. And so it's just not something that to them is all that big of a deal. It's something that is more, just stirring up trouble more than anything else, and they'd rather just sort of leave it alone. And some of them are also just rather turned off by some, particularly people like Garrison, who could be extremely radical. A lot of Northerners didn't like that. They were turned off by that kind of extreme message of some abolitionists, particularly people like Garrison, that they saw as being just a little bit too extreme. So for Northerners, while you do have some people embracing it, it is overall an attitude of resistance and indifference. All of that backlash that we saw in that video last week, that was coming from the North, much less the South. So there's a long way to go when it comes to convincing people that abolition was something that needed to be fought for. Now, the Southern response we're going to look at a little bit more specifically. Obviously, we know, did the South support abolition or not? Certainly not. They react quite defensively and quite violently in some cases. If Garrison and others were being threatened and all that in the North, you can imagine what would have happened to them if they'd ever tried to come to the South. So Southern response, for one thing, is, and this is something that really, it's they have been doing this all along. They don't just start doing it because abolition gets a moral conscience, but they certainly will get more vocal about it, is they basically come up with arguments, or they really already had these arguments, but they continue to argue against everything that the abolitionists were saying. They defend slavery. Not only saying it's economically crucial, that's always going to be probably their number one argument, is that it was absolutely vital to the economy. But they also come up with other arguments to defend slavery itself and to say, people like Garrison are wrong, they don't understand, this is not a cruel system, this is really quite a humane and civilized institution. Some of those arguments include, and these are kind of, the reason I put these together like this is they're not exactly the same argument, but they are similar, as you'll see. The positive good argument and the happy slave argument, they are similar, but a little bit different. The positive good argument, and it was named that, or it kind of takes on that name, because John C. Calhoun is the one that used those words, calling slavery a positive good. Basically arguing that slavery was the best thing for African Americans because, clearly this is based on incredibly racist beliefs at the time, based on this racist belief that African Americans were inferior, that they were not intelligent, that they were not capable of freedom, that they would not be able to take care of themselves, that they were childlike, and they needed somebody to look after them. And that's what slave owners were doing, that this was a very wholesome system in which everybody wins because slaves are being cared for and they're being looked after by people that know what's best for them. And if they were free, they would just make bad decisions and they wouldn't be able to support themselves.
They do. I don't think they realized how positive it is.
No, I don't think so either. But it certainly does. To them, it sounded like we are lovely people because we keep slaves. That's honestly that it was a very moral institution, believe it or not. The happy slave argument is kind of similar to that. It argues, just like the name suggests, that slaves were what? Happy with this situation, that they didn't want freedom. This is saying that slaves enjoyed their work, that they had good relationships with their owners, that they weren't resisting, that there was no tension, that this was all a very family-like, very caring kind of relationship. Whether they actually thought, I think some people probably do believe that, yes. Whether or not others are, just saying stuff to make an argument, probably. But I think some of them may have, well, people still believe this. You have people defending, slavery wasn't that bad. You hear that all the time. So I don't think it's ever 100% gone away, to be honest. And that's, images like this one, for example, perpetuate this happy slave argument. What do you notice here about the slaves in this picture?
They're happy, they have nice clothes.
They've got nice clothes. There's food here, they're dancing. That's a common image that you would have seen. Slaves smiling, slaves dancing, slaves, and notice, look, the white slave owners obviously right here, right there with them. Like it's just one big party. Again, arguing that there is no tension. And they love to point out, they love to say, see, this is so much better and so much more civilized than your paid workers that you've got in your factories because, you know, at least we treat people nicely. You know, you're paying your workers nothing and they're living in squalor and going on a strike and you've got riots and all that. This is the more civilized way to do things. So they love to point that out, to say, you know, factory work, all that business, that's really slavery. This is a very Christian system, as odd as that sounds. So that's a real common thing. They also use biblical arguments to defend slavery, using the Bible to back up slavery, to claim that slavery is biblically supported, and that it is therefore a Christian-based system, that it is, in fact, ordained by God, using certain scriptures, some passages from Hebrews, for example, that talk about the master and slave relationships. There's some parts of the writings of Paul that talk about slaves obeying their masters and that sort of thing, and demanding obedience of slaves and that kind of thing. Jesus never speaks against slavery in any of the Gospels, different things like that, to say that slavery was a Christian system and that this was a Christian duty of slave owners to practice slavery and to, you know, bring Christianity to their slaves and civilize slaves and all that kind of stuff. Obviously controversial even then. In fact, that's where you eventually get some schisms in some religious groups over that. In fact, that's where Southern Baptists come from, was a split within the Baptist church because the Baptist church didn't want to appoint slave owners to like missionary positions. And so the Southern Baptists broke off from it because they supported slavery and allowing slave owners to hold certain positions, including missionary posts throughout the world and stuff like that. They also responded in practical ways like banning abolitionist literature, that's stuff like Liberator and all that kind of thing. So not allowing stuff like that to be circulated in the South, you know, not allowing it to be sold or used. And that, you know, works reasonably well, I guess. But just kind of trying to shut up abolitionists and not allowing those kind of things to be read. Now, you can't get rid of all of it. It's still going to trickle down in there. But it does silence it a little bit. And speaking of silencing it, another way, probably a legal measure that Southerners take to make sure that abolitionist talk doesn't get around is in 1836, the House of Representatives passes a gag rule or a gag order on any kind of abolitionist talk. A gag rule, what's a gag? Like in a...
It's like a thing that restricts you from speaking.
Yeah, so you know, like in movies and stuff, when they have the prisoner tied up, they got tape over their mouth or something in their mouth to keep them from talking, that's a gag. So the gag rule, again, this was passed in the House of Representatives, meant that any measures that were hostile to slavery or that Southerners deemed as being hostile to slavery, whether it was outright abolition or anything else, they would immediately table it. They wouldn't even talk about it. In other words, there's a gag on the slavery issue itself. So they would not even discuss those things. They would not even be debated, much less be, made decisions about. So the gag rule is basically saying we're not even going to discuss, we're not even going to talk about anything related to slavery, certainly anything that Southerners might deem as hostile to slavery. Now keep in mind, you're talking about the House of Representatives here. It's not like people on the street can't talk about it. But this keeps Congress for a long time, considering any kind of measures, any kind of bills that might have had anything at all to do with slavery. Now that gag rule eventually expires. But at the time, Southerners had enough support in Congress to get that passed. But that's another way that they kind of keep slavery out of the national conversation, keep slavery out of the political agenda. But eventually they will not have that power anymore, and eventually other things are going to start happening that force it, and that really force abolition and slavery to take the place and to eclipse all these other reform movements we've looked at, some of them we haven't looked at yet, but things like temperance, which we'll look at tomorrow, and women's rights and all that kind of stuff eventually have to take a back seat to it, because slavery will eventually dominate the conversation. So the growth of abolition, we're going to continue to look at that and talk about how that continues to become a further agitated question, eventually becoming something that Southerners can no longer ignore, the Northerners can no longer ignore. So we'll continue to see that as we go along. Okay.